Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Sex Nerd Podcast. Today, we are going to be speaking with Dr. Alex Layendecker, Air Force pilot, sexologist, and one of the leading voices in the advocacy of researching sex in space. Stay tuned. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Sex Nerd Podcast. We're just going to jump into it with Alex today. So, Alex, tell me, has anyone ever had sex in space?
Hey, V, good morning. Yeah, I would say that's always sort of the first question out the gate whenever this topic comes up. A lot of speculation
Oh,
a lot of speculation that's always been out there for years. To give my answer that I would say I give to everybody, yes and no, depending on on what context you put sex in, what you qualify as sex.
okay.
So,
Well, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Masturbation has definitely occurred. That has been
Is that
alluded.
something that NASA is publicly like they're acknowledging that?
Not NASA directly. NASA and most space agencies actually will they'll tend to always address this question as saying it's a non-issue. We don't study that. That's not what we're about. Which is, if you look at what their role is as an agency, I can understand that because they are engineering organizations and they are about engineering vehicles and getting people into space and getting people across space. And that is more their focus as a group of scientists and engineers. As far as astronauts directly addressing it, there have been American astronauts who in their memoirs have discussed some elements of sexual physiology. Michael Collins, who was one of the Apollo 11 moon crew, actually in his memoirs had talked about when he was going up for the Skylab missions, there was a NASA doctor that was recommending to the crew that they masturbate at least occasionally, sort of just to kind of keep the pipes clean and functioning and to prevent prostate inflammation and possible, urinary tract infections, things like that.
Okay.
So from a masturbation side, that's just the Americans, and then we know for a fact that the Russians have been known to bring porn and alcohol into space. So assuming that they use it, at least on occasion, somebody has in the past, I think it would be sort of foolish to think otherwise.
So, Alex, you hear a lot about or astronauts often mention how their lives are incredibly structured, strictly structured when they're away on space missions. And from the time they get up and bathroom usage to the time they sleep and everything in between, where would they find time for more personal activities like masturbation, or is that in their schedule as well?
So definitely not officially in their schedule. I don't think that's anything you would ever see show up on a published NASA schedule. The astronauts are granted hygiene time and personal time, so they have structured time where they are intended to sleep to make sure that they're getting enough sleep with each cycle. And you already have to consider that life on the International Space Station, or even just in space when you're in orbit, is pretty strenuous. You've got a lot of interruption of circadian rhythm. There's a lot of noise on the space station. You have a sunrise, if you will, every 90 minutes that the ISS goes around the Earth. So the sun is coming up and going down every 90 minutes or so. So that can sort of mess with your senses and your systems a little bit. Initially, when folks arrive to the space station, they have a lot of physiological adjustment that is going on. So, for example, astronauts tend to get very stuffy in their head because fluid shift in their body. So more fluid is going to their head, and their brain is interpreting it as you respond pretty much as if you had a cold. And also their brain interprets it as excess fluid in the body, and they start to shed extra fluid. So initially, when they get up there, normally for at least the first week or so, they're going to the bathroom more because their body is tending to dump all that excess fluid.
Okay.
So as far as personal time, that is obviously when it would have to happen, whenever that structured personal time is.
Mhm.
But given the hum of operations and just how much they have on their plate, I could completely see that many of them just find it to be too busy of a time,
Mhm.
and it doesn't cross their minds as much.
Okay. So now what about coupling?
Coupling. Okay, so there has been, again, lots of speculation in this area, and it tends to be a question where if you ever ask a NASA representative about it, they will shut the question down.
Shut
And
it
we can
down or
get,
deny it?
well, so
Just like
both.
move on, move on.
Yeah, pretty much move on in a sense, and we can talk a little bit more about why they,
Sure.
why they tend to go that route. I already talked a little bit about how they tend to be more of an engineering focused organization, and they don't want to address those issues just yet.
Sure.
Doesn't mean that it couldn't potentially happen in the future. There was actually an article that came out a couple days ago. I forget who published it. It may have been Daily Mail by UK. That the title of it was NASA admits that it might be time to study sex in space. That was in response to a paper that had been released just a little while ago, back about a couple months ago. And there's been a sort of public awareness campaign that's been going on since. So that dynamic starting to shift is already pretty interesting in its own right.
Up until this point, they haven't admitted that coupling has happened. Or are you finding that in memoirs from astronauts, like again with like the masturbation issue?
So nobody has ever admitted that there's been a coupling in space. There has been a married astronaut couple, a NASA astronaut couple that went into space in, I want to say it was 1992, ST-47. Those were the astronauts Mark Lee and Jan Davis, and I know they're tired of having their names brought up over and over again when this topic gets brought up, but they were the first married couple ever to go into space together. They actually met each other in the training program, got married in secret, and let NASA know, I believe it was only a few months, maybe even just a couple months before the mission was supposed to go up. This became public knowledge, and it was sort of already too late to assign a new astronaut to the mission. Normally you train for these missions for at least 2 years.
Okay.
When you're scheduled to go up to the space station or up on the shuttle, when we had it. And NASA was obviously not too pleased. There was a lot of press surrounding a married couple going up into space, and obviously this came up as a question. They tried to handle it as professionally as they could from a PR standpoint, and as I understand it, the couple were actually put on opposite schedules. That was sort of their penance for the duration of the mission. I want to say that mission was a 14-day mission. I could be wrong. I'll have to go back and check. But so they're up there for a couple weeks. Mae Jemison was also on that mission, I know. And there has been speculation about, would they have gotten enough privacy? Would the other astronauts have, just said, hey, this is kind of ridiculous, and we should provide them at least, a couple minutes to be alone, whether or not sex happens. But so there's been speculation around that couple for decades at this point. And like I said, I'm sure they're tired of it. Actually, if 92, so it's 20 years.
Yeah.
Oh no, I'm sorry, 30 years at this point, because we're in 2022.
Right.
And I'm sure they still have to field the occasional question and give them the same answer that they always have. The Russians, there's been a lot of speculation about the possibility of Russians hooking up in orbit. They culturally tend to be a lot more sexually forward than Americans. So we as a culture, I think you and I can both agree, can tend to be somewhat prudish, and sex is, some dirty thing that we don't like to talk about.
Right.
The Russians are not like that. and you have had incidents of males and females being together for extended periods of time up in modules or on Mir, who, there's been lots of speculation around that. The first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, I may have butchered her name there, but she actually went up on a solo mission, was up for a few days, and then came back down. The first male and female, I won't say coupling, but combination of human males and females in space was Svetlana Savitskaya, and I may have butchered her name as well. She was the first female cosmonaut to be combined with male counterparts up in space. But my understanding from the memoirs is that there was a lot of misogyny that was going on with that first mission, and she said that they greeted her. This is a direct quote from her. She said that they greeted her at the hatch with an apron as a joke. Yeah, so kind of not cool. And I mean, my first thought there is like, those guys aren't going to get laid.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's been a lot of speculation, mostly sort of gossip around have humans coupled up there. There have been animal experiments that started with the Russians, where rats have attempted mating with rats and other animals. I mean, there's a whole host of animals that smaller creatures, fruit flies, for example, Medaka fish, that have been mated in space. So we could study the reproductive aspects of microgravity radiation, what effects those have on our physiological systems.
Right. Well, I think the viewers would be most interested in whether or not humans have, especially because it's still speculated whether or not they have. But
them and me as well. But
yeah, the mechanics of that, because you see that in adult film and so forth. And I think there was even a company that took some adult film stars up in one of those what I like to call drop jets, zero G jets. And and they've attempted to see if it could be reproducible and what the dynamics would be, physics and how
in terms of pop culture, that's the concept of sex in space has been around for a while. I mean, it was in a James Bond film, Moonraker. There's a sex and space scene there. There was a 2015. Well, first off, before they deorbited Mir, the Russian space agency Roscosmos had actually agreed to film a pornographic film up in Mir for a price of, I want to say they had accepted an offer of $23 million. This was when, and actors had been recruited for it. I believe it was a Russian producer.
Okay.
And the Russians at this point were almost open to anything from a funding perspective, because funding was getting hard to come by for them, as far as just keeping things going.
Right.
Mir was deorbited before that ever happened. I want to say, when did we deorbit Mir? It was maybe 2000. And then there have been other attempts and incidents ever since. So when I was getting close to finishing my dissertation in this area back in 2015, got a notification that there were two porn stars that had started a crowdfunding campaign sponsored by Pornhub. And this was 2015. I remember Johnny Sins was the actor, and Eva, what was her name? We can look it up. Hell, we can even provide the link. I think the video is still up there.
Right.
For the crowdfunding request.
Yep.
So that was sponsored by Pornhub. I don't think they ever raised enough. They raised over $250,000, but they had to raise something like 3.4 or something like that.
Right.
Where they had made an agreement with a private commercial organization to go film a porn in space, and that never materialized.
Right.
If it had, that
expensive.
It is exceptionally expensive. I would say it's like $10,000 a kilogram or maybe a pound to launch stuff into space. So
Right.
commercial companies getting into the game has started to bring that cost down. So you've got players like SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic,
Right.
that over the last couple of years we've started. I mean, SpaceX obviously being the front runner, and they, no kidding, have a pretty redundant capacity that they've been able to launch stuff into space for much cheaper, and they've got contracts with NASA, etc.
Right.
As far as commercial passengers, yes, you've had Blue Origin has brought commercial passengers up into space. Virgin Galactic has brought,
Notoriously, William Shatner, of course. Yeah.
yeah, William Shatner was brought up there. So this is, at least in a commercial sense, starting to make much better progress, and it's becoming more important that we start to study the aspects of human reproduction and intimacy and sexuality in those environments, because we're going to have all the same problems up there that we have down here, just probably exacerbated by the environment.
By the environment. And so that's a great segue into the next question that I had, which was, obviously you've devoted the last 7 years at minimum of your life academically and personally in that particular field. So I think a lot of people would ask, especially because it's getting more mainstream notice, is how does one get into this field of research? But let me parse that and start with how you got into it, and then we can look at the field more broadly and its history. So tell me a little bit about what, where you started with this and how you got interested in this particular field of researching sex in space.
So yeah, I have kind of an odd story. It honestly was almost me stumbling into it, and almost at sort of I would say the last minute. So I had been studying sexuality as a student, as a master's and a doctoral student since I want to say early 2009, at least.
Okay.
Early 2009. I knew that I wanted to go on to a PhD, but I originally started off more, what I was focused on was the application of military sciences, combination of military sciences and forensic sciences and the sexual sciences all sort of together.
Yeah.
You should know this as my PhD chair in the conversations that we had.
Dissertation committee, that's right. Yeah.
But I'll explain for the folks watching. Realized as we were, as I was getting closer to the end, that I was probably never going to finish. There was too much convoluted data and lack of access to enough data in these areas that I knew I had to finish. I had to do it quickly because I, at that point, been selected for pilot training for the Air Force, and I knew that there was going to be a hard set date where I would have to leave. And once I was in pilot training, I was probably never going to get a PhD after that.
Right.
So I had to get done, and I'd always had sort of at the back of my mind sex in space, as far as studying it being something that I would be interested in doing down the road. I already had a background in space operations when I was originally going to school at the Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality, which is where we both got our degrees.
That's right.
I was working in the space operations side of the military, so doing space launch off the West Coast, and felt that, hey, at least I can approach the study of this from a somewhat informed perspective, because I understand the space operations world, or at least I have a good enough grasp of it to work within it. And had contacts at NASA, had contacts in the commercial space industry, who I knew that I could try to go down these pathways and get some answers. So that eventually led me to the work of Dr. Raymond Noonan, who did his dissertation on this very topic in 1998 out of New York.
Long ago.
Yeah. No, the field is, this particular section of the field, sexology is only what, 100 odd years old.
Sure.
As a field. never had really huge traction in the States until the 50s, with with the Kinsey Institute and Alfred Kinsey.
Yeah.
And this field specifically as it applies to space, some folks have termed it space sexology. Dr. Noonan, he coined the term space sexology in his dissertation.
Okay.
I referred to it when I was doing my research as astrosexology, just as any science as it applies to outer space. So you got astrophysics, astrobiology,
Sure.
and then the application of the sexual sciences to these outer space environments, and how our intimacy and reproductive function and all the rest of it is wound into that. So I found his work, and his dissertation was over 300 pages long, I want to say.
Wow.
So it was extensive. It was an analysis of the space life sciences against the sexual sciences. And the space life sciences are the study of human functioning and how humans really can live and work in space. But they, to that point, had not really addressed human sexuality in almost any regard. And even reproduction, mammalian reproduction, had not really been studied very much. The Russians were the first to, I already mentioned the experiment with the rats. That was, I want to say that was Cosmos 1129. That was in 1979 that mission went up. It was a biosat. And in the early 90s, the United States actually on a few shuttle missions set up some rat studies, so aptly named rodents 1, 2, and 3. And then there was a neurolab experiment that they conducted, and Dr. April Ronka, who is, she's a professor of obstetrics gynecology at, I want to say, Wake Forest University still, but she was also a NASA fellow and a NASA researcher. Had been the principal scientist on those experiments, and those looked at reproductive factors in space for mammals, because that was, I would say, pretty much the furthest that you could get away with from a scientific perspective of, hey, we want a very clear rodent experiment to study these factors. We're not going to dip our toes too deep in. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but there are funding issues that are tied with NASA funding. Yeah, so where you have Congress is funding NASA, and NASA has to fund some of these experiments. So even if they are interested in funding it, there is always the potential political backlash of folks who don't want taxpayer dollars going to studying sex in space. The scandal, the horror.
Right.
So sorry to bring this back around. So I, looking at Dr. Noonan's work, it was almost, at that point, almost 20 years on, by the time I published my dissertation. I think it was 18 years later. And I was the first sexologist since him to really delve into this area that I was able to find. There have been a couple sexologists who had touched on it lightly in papers, specifically about reproductive aspects and whatnot.
Prior to your dissertation?
Well, prior to even Noonan.
Okay. So even further back.
Yeah,
so this is not necessarily a new field.
No, it's been around for decades at this point. It's been established for decades as a research field.
Okay.
And since then, it started to, I would say, gain some traction. So when I published my dissertation, I discovered that not a lot had changed research-wise from the issues that Noonan had brought up in his dissertation almost 2 decades prior. So I tried to build on his ideas and realized that the biggest problem was the fact that we weren't. Yes, there are a lot of problems. There are a lot of answers that need to be found, and a lot of truths that need to be discovered. But if you're not studying the topic and you're not funding study for the topic, you're never going to get those answers anyway. So what I had actually proposed in my dissertation was a astrosexological.
Did you propose some kind of a solution?
Yeah, I proposed the Astrosexological Research Institute, as I call it.
Okay.
or ASRI.
Okay.
So still conceptual at this point, but it doesn't necessarily just have to be a brick and mortar. I mean, it could be a network of individuals. Plan is to eventually have it be an actual brick and mortar institution with locations, and hopefully an international level institution with locations around the world.
Well, now aside from ASRI, but it sounds like Noonan kind of started that process, and you took that process further in proposing a very specific direction, or a way in which these problems could be solved or addressed. Let's say that to address them first in a structured way. It sounds like that to me.
Yeah, I mean, even Noonan had recommended a research structure of, hey, these are the areas that need to be looked at. These are all the concerns. So we can have all the questions in the world if we don't do something to actually start answering the questions. We're just going to be paddling in place as we have been the last couple of decades.
And did both of you propose something beyond the biological?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So his dissertation, my dissertation, and even papers published since. I published a paper, co-authored a paper in 2018 with Dr. Shana Pandya, who's actually currently an astronaut candidate.
So you published a paper. What journal was that published in?
So that was actually published in 2018 by Springer Hill. It was in a larger work. It was the Handbook of Life Support Systems for Spacecraft and Extraterrestrial Habitats.
Okay.
Stumble over my own tongue
That's a
here.
title.
Yeah, and like I said, published that with Dr. Pandya. She's an MD by trade, and we examined the logistics of reproduction in space. So we primarily focused on the biomedical, but did bring up a little bit of the potential for psychological aspects. So you have to worry in these extreme environments, especially when you are subject to extreme isolation.
Yeah.
The exacerbation of issues that might not be as big of a deal here on Earth, or I don't want to use the words as big of a deal. It's always a big deal. But if you have issues of things like sexual assault that might come out sooner than later, if you're talking about micro societies and extremely isolated personnel.
Okay.
So there's always concern around that. An old adage for space is whatever your problems are on Earth, they're always going to be more extreme when they're brought into outer space. And that's why screening for astronauts, for example, psychological screening and social dynamics and how you interact with other people is a big deal when it comes to astronaut selection, and especially when they're selecting for long-term missions. That's something that has to be looked at and has to be considered.
Right. Well, I could be wrong, but I'm under the impression that psychological testing, et cetera, has sort of been a mainstay of space research and space missions from its outset, I would imagine, considering the extreme environments that we're sending humans into.
So the psychology portion of it has always, I want to say, been important, but the space life sciences have actually seen their funding get cut.
Oh.
At NASA and other agencies over really over the last couple decades. It's become more and more of a back burner sort of area when it needs to be more at the forefront, or at least needs to be studied well in tandem with the development of these vehicles, because we're talking about sending people to Mars,
right?
And we're talking about long duration missions. This isn't something that you want to get to the point where you can launch people to Mars. You have the capability, but all of a sudden you realize we don't know how to get them there safely in terms of their physiological health, in terms of their mental health. How do we deal with all these other problems that will pop up once we're able to put pink squishy bodies in spacecraft and
Right.
send them over there.
Well, that actually brings me to the next question, which is like, where do you see the field going in terms of research? Where is it headed, since it's been so notoriously underfunded and a political minefield?
So as I argued in my dissertation, I think that the best solution is going to be ultimately to have this be more of a private and commercial partnership field of research. There is a commercial company that popped up in the last couple of years, Spaceborne United, based over in the Netherlands, that and you can see them on spaceborneunited.com is their website, that has come out and stated specifically that this is what they are going to study, and they're going to provide these solutions as a commercial entity. So I know their CEO well. He's a great guy. We've had many conversations. I've been sort of an unofficial, trying to provide advice where I can in any sort of advisory capacity.
An unofficial consultant.
Yeah. And originally, when they came out the gate, they had announced that they were going to try to have a baby in space by 2024, which is only 2 years from now.
Oh, wow.
And I think this happened. Yeah, this occurred right before I was supposed to speak at a conference where I was speaking on this very topic. I found out about it hours prior. And so I reached out to some of my contacts who had contact information for him, reached out and said, hey, this is me, this is who I am, can we talk really fast? And once we were able to connect, I stated to him, I said, hey, there might be some, as you put it earlier, an ethical, political minefield of medical, every type of issue that you could think of. There's a lot of issues that you're going to have to navigate here, and you might be sailing into this minefield without even realizing it at this point.
Right. And I think, if I remember correctly, just discussing this topic had the potential to be a career killer, especially if you were in NASA or in its affiliates, or someone that I think was
they're
affected by these being hamstrung by politics and funding.
So one of the most prominent examples I could probably give, there was a NASA psychologist, Yvonne Clearwater, who she published, I think it was she wrote a sidebar for a newspaper article. I forget which newspaper it was. It may have been a publication in San Francisco, where she just brought up the fact that humans going into space, adult humans going into space, who are regular, healthy adults, you could expect them to have regular, healthy sexual appetites, and we should prepare for that. It's not something that we should just disregard completely. And she was actually involved, I think at the time she was involved in designing quieter sleeping quarters for the crew so that they could rest better. On a project that she was at. I believe she was with NASA Ames Research Center at the time. And there was a book by a journalist, Laura Woodmansey, that came out I think it was published in 2006, which from a sort of it's more of a pop culture book, but it pretty substantively covers a lot of these questions of, hey, has anybody had sex in space? Talks about that kind of stuff. Talks about reproductive aspects and some of the experiments that have happened, and it did discuss this incident. And in Woodmansey's words, if I could quote her real quick, she said, from the reaction to her sidebar, you would have thought that she was advocating genocide.
Wow.
So unquote. So it almost killed her career. Apparently NASA had to deal with this huge uproar from Congress. There were publications that followed that said, do you want your tax dollars funding sex in space and all that, just the tabloid response that would be typical. And I believe NASA had to assign somebody, for a PR person, for 6 months, possibly a year, just to deal with Congress. after this incident. So she did thankfully go on to have a full career with NASA, and went on to continue to do well. But
Oh, good.
she, I think a few years later at a conference, somebody floated the question again to her, and she shut the questioner down immediately.
Wow.
She said, that is a non-issue. We don't study it. It's a non-issue. Done.
Oh, wow.
That was pretty much her reaction. So you can see it had a very negative effect on her personally.
Right.
And, her association with it was null at that point.
Well, so now we've addressed the history, we've addressed, where the field might be going. What do you see? Well, when is all of this, now that it seems to be getting more mainstream traction, when do you think these things are going to happen, when we're going to be officially studying sexual reproduction and sexuality in, space, and what that might look like? Is there a timeline? Has anyone designed a timeline of when we're going to start? I mean, is there still political resistance to this field of study?
So I think in terms of funding, there will always be political resistance, which is why I advocated for a private institution like ASRI that could partner with
15.
companies,
Okay.
companies like Spaceborne. There was also a paper that was released recently, titled "The Case for Space Sexology," that was released.
Harkening back to Noonan.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So they also use the term space sexology. I think they may have slightly redefined the term at the beginning of their paper to, saying to include intimacy and other psychological factors. But I would have to give them credit. They've been on a pretty decent PR campaign. They have gained a lot of traction in terms of getting attention and eyes put on this field, which I'm all for, because it remains a problem and it needs to be studied. Like all fields, though, I think like all science, it is tempting to make big leaps forward, and to come roaring out the gate, which
that could bring its own repercussions.
It can, depending on who you're interacting with. So you still have to, I think at this point in history, we're still having to sort of walk on eggshells with regard to how we interact with the agencies. The entire point of something like ASRI is to remove the necessity for them to have to deal with this question, because they can just refer, anybody that comes to them with a question about these issues can just refer them to the private commercial institution that specifically deals with these issues. That's the entire reason they exist.
Sure.
So there are experiments that have been put together by NASA researchers that have been advocated for. The most recent one that I'd seen is a project called MICEHAB, which that's an acronym, and it was based on a previous experiment, the rodent Mark III habitat, which was also designed by April Ronca and fellow researchers. I think Ken Souza was another chief researcher on that project. But the rodent Mark III habitat was essentially a multi-generational rodent colony. The MICEHAB project is actually larger, and it builds on the Mark III designs, because I want to say Mark III, they published that paper in 2013. I think was their, that final workshop was in March of 2013. Actually, we're coming up on the, what would this be, the 9th anniversary of it? Yeah. Still hasn't happened. They've sought funding for it, but obviously never got funded. The MICEHAB project, which stands for Multi-Generational Independent Colony for Extraterrestrial Habitation, Autonomy, and Behavioral Health.
And that's what I was going to ask. When you have something of that nature, you're not just studying the reproduction. You're studying the behavioral issues of that particular colony. How
are core behaviors affected over time as each generation in that environment is born into it. So if you think in the future, we're going to have hopefully future generations of humans that are born off world,
Well, I think Musk
they
is
will have
heading in that
never known
direction.
Earth.
Doesn't he want to have humans on Mars in 2 years?
I don't know if 2 years, but I do believe that he wanted to have a starship land on Mars within the next 2 years. I think at least that, but I don't know if humans were going to be on that one.
All right.
But within a few years after that, yes, they are aiming to put humans on the surface and to begin the process of establishing a multi-generational human colony on Mars. But if you look at Mars, it is a planet that has 1% of the atmosphere that Earth has. It has 38% of the gravity. There's no liquid water right now on the surface. There's some frozen water that they found, but there's no significant magnetosphere enough to protect human beings from heavy ionizing radiation, galactic cosmic radiation just coming and hitting the surface.
Yep.
So just living on Mars, we're going to have to live beneath the surface, in tunnels that are 12 to 14 feet down, because that's the amount of regolith that you would need to make up for the huge, massive Earth atmosphere that is above us right now when we're here living on the surface.
Sure.
And we also have the benefit of the Earth's magnetosphere, which essentially generates a magnetic shield around the planet and catches most of the galactic cosmic radiation before it ever punches through and goes down to the atmosphere. Most ionizing radiation particles will penetrate down to probably about 60,000 feet before they collide with an air particle. But that mass of air particles above us provides additional shielding, and the magnetosphere catches most of the particles before they ever go down into the atmosphere.
Right.
So we have this cocoon effect. We have this benefit of protection from extreme space radiation that we have been able to develop from single cell organisms all the way to the sentient organisms that we are.
Right. Yeah.
Mars doesn't have that.
Right.
And you also have to consider the fact that we have, in our process of evolution, evolving from single cell all the way to what we are now, that has all occurred in a one Earth gravity well. So 9.807 meters per second acceleration rate of gravity is what biologically we have developed under. And to suddenly and radically alter that by the experiment data that we've done on mammals so far, that can have some profound impacts when you're talking about, especially when you're talking about the synergistic effect of radiation and microgravity together.
Right.
Just changing those constants in a way that physiologically can deeply affect us.
Well, and I would imagine, and aside from some of the more superficial conversation there is surrounding this most recent PR campaign, we have to consider, especially where reproduction is concerned, the ethical aspects to how children or infants can be affected by a completely different environment from our own.
Yeah, and that's why hey, slow and steady will win the race here, because there are so many medical ethical dilemmas that go along with it. Now we need to get the data. We need to run experiments. So another thing, you already know this, but for the viewers, that I had proposed in my dissertation was what I call the radio double E scale, which is reproduction and development in off-Earth environments, essentially meant to capture biological data of what levels of microgravity and what levels of radiation could be acceptable during the development process. So prenatal, postnatal growth, obviously, fertilization, and I even talk about the human sexual response cycle. How are we physiologically going to be able to respond? Because there have been conflicting reports on what our sexual physiology does in outer space environments, at least in microgravity environments. Some men have reported the quote space Viagra effect, where they have erections so intense it's almost painful. And some astronauts have reported there was no activity in that region whatsoever. So even the physiological aspect of it, we need to do research on the practicality of sexual interaction, sexual intercourse in space. There's a lot of questions there still. I think most of them, just using what we know about how even liquid dynamics and how people move around in those environments, most of those questions I think we can get a 90% answer to already.
Right.
But you still sort of need the actual data, the proof. So you do need to run physiological experiments. You especially need to run reproductive experiments. And I think that the way to structure that is to start with smaller mammals like rodents. I think the mice hab is a great idea. That's actually intended to be a autonomous space station or space module. So it's in orbit and it's run by robots. And
already today.
No.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's
not
proposed.
Already.
Okay, that's what's been proposed.
That would be amazing.
That would be amazing. Yeah.
But
because that's what you're saying has been proposed based on the previous experiment.
Yeah, it's been proposed. So Mark III never got funded and never happened, and MICEHAP has not been funded yet, and it's not happened to my knowledge. I will be super excited when it does, because I think that is sort of the big first step. Sure. Just for biological reproductive data.
Yeah.
And we can start filling in the radio E scale and like versions of it. So once we start to build that picture, we can start to move on to possibly larger mammals. So some of our closest ape relatives like bonobos or chimps. I know that there's been sort of a research moratorium on using ape subjects, but we don't also want to have human babies just be lab rats in the sense as we go into these environments.
Of course.
So we do need to take measured steps forward, and an institution like ASRI and commercial institutions like Spaceborne, I think, will be, partner with other sexological institutions, possibly the Kinsey Institute and European counterparts, would be the best approach to do this.
Well, it sounds like, yeah, with regard to, when is this going to happen? Well, we have to see, because it's a combination of funding, ethics, and how much we can convince those governmental bodies to move past their own concerns, not move past their own concerns, but even just have the conversation to begin with.
Yeah, we need to be adults about having we haven't been adults about sexuality in general in the States for a long time. Yeah. We're still struggling to have this conversation, and it's led to this back and forth of extremes, which I don't think is really, really healthy for anybody. But we can have conversations about that offline.
Right.
I
know you have some things coming up, and I know there's certain things you can't disclose, but rather than disclose anything that you have coming up, you are continuing to move forward in your efforts to realize not only what you spoke about in your dissertation and subsequent papers, but also going all the way back to Dr. Noonan's work, it sounds like, at least from what you shared with me last night.
Yes. So,
and like I said, you don't have to give anything away. You don't have to give anything away, but you continue to move forward in your efforts as well, and you yourself are getting some attention, which I think is important, because you're coming at it from such a scientifically pure perspective, if that would be the right way I would describe it.
So yeah, it's funny too, being a quote part-time sexologist. So because obviously as of right now my full-time occupation is with the military, and my obligations there, but the last couple of years have been pretty interesting. There were, for example, conferences I was supposed to speak at that were getting canceled because of COVID, and have managed to to thankfully publish a paper in this area. But again, it is going to be, I think it's going to continue to be a slow and steady wins the race. So there needs to be advocacy in this field. There needs to be an expansion of researchers in the field. So, continuing serious science. And trying to keep our own biases out of it as well.
So to kind of bring all of this back together, what I think would be the most important is to remember that, the way forward is it's a collaborative effort. It's the science is a process. It's not a thing or a person, it's a process, and that process continues, and the contributions are what is most important in moving this whole field forward. Is, like you said, bringing in researchers from all kinds of different disciplines.
Yeah, if you look at sexology from just a broader perspective, regular sexology. So Yvonne Bloch, who is, a lot of people consider him to be the founder of the field. He was a German dermatologist from Berlin. He had referred to this as the general science of mankind, mostly because it interfaces with almost every other science you can think of in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, sexology is inherently multidisciplinary.
Yeah. So obviously, you want to bring in scientists from almost every aspect. A lot of different people could contribute in this area and getting the answers to a lot of these questions. And it's important to continue to advocate for it and to speak out, to interface with organizations. And that was something that this most recent paper, which was published in late 2021, the case for space sexology, which I think we can probably put a link up for it or something maybe, which was done by 5 Canadian researchers. They pretty much reiterated the importance of studying a lot of this stuff, and reiterated a lot of the points that have been made by Dr. Noonan, myself, and almost every other researcher in this field, including NASA physicians that had run actual experiments in the 80s and 90s. It's important that we all keep moving the ball forward. And I think that, as the Canadians stated in their paper, this research has gone unaddressed for far too long. It should have been being addressed this entire time. But now that we are so close to commercial organizations putting regular people up in space, they're talking about space hotels, they're talking about being able to send people to Mars within the next decade. Sure. Those are things that I think are actually going to happen. We've been saying for the last 50 years that tomorrow is just around the corner as far as future world and future land.
Sure.
With all this all this amazing spaceborne technology, which there were multiple reasons why that didn't materialize, primarily because of it was all done through national agencies at the time. But with the dawn of commercial entities that have really been making real progress in this field, we could see the advent of things like space tourism and personal space travel happen in the coming years. So now that we are on the cusp of that occurring, you have to address sexuality as a concern, especially given the moral ethical dilemma surrounding reproduction in such extreme environments, which could lead to malformation growth, and stunted development, things like that, if we do have children as a result. If it can even be done, that's another question we have to get the answers to, is can it be done? Because if we can't establish a second planetary home, then our existential insurance policy that is commonly talked about among the the space race advocates could end up being a moot point. A moot point,
right?
Which there are ways to address it. There are ways to mitigate these effects. None of them are cheap, but there are ways to mitigate the most negative effects and establish human colonies in space environments. That's another long discussion though.
Right. I can always have another episode on that. Right. Well, I think we've brought it back around full circle here. And I'm, as just as a side, you and I collaborated on an exhibit in the museum.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
I forget
it's
about
still
that
there.
sometimes.
It's still, no, and we continue to build on it and add, and actually we're adding like a robotic AI companion to the exhibit. Yeah, FYI, now you just found that out.
Oh, neat.
We've had her for a while, and we're figuring out how to add her to that exhibit. Because there are conversations about, teledildonics and so forth, and in remote intimacy and so forth. But anyway, so yeah, we still have that exhibit at the museum, which goes into a lot of the science that you did in your paper, and especially in particular 6 astral bodies that you chose just from our solar system. But I can just invite the folks to come and see the exhibit that's based on your work at the museum. But I'm glad that we got the time to kind of cover this, especially with the attention it's getting lately, and to try to encourage just regular folks to maybe reach out to their Congress people and say, hey, this is important for a number of different reasons, none of which were superficial. So I guess with that, unless you have anything else to add, we could probably wrap up. I think we've covered the topic as extensively as you can in an hour, right?
Yeah.
But there's always something else. So how can people like follow your work? Do you have social media? Like what are some of the ways folks can follow your work specifically?
Yeah, I mean, we could probably put links in, right? If
into the
video. Yeah, you can follow me. I'm just at Alex Layendecker on Twitter, and I think Instagram as well.
Okay.
Which I primarily just use for putting up links and podcasts and whatnot.
Right. Now, so for folks that aren't going to look at the description, like Alex, of course, is ALEX, but spell your last name.
Oh, LAYENDECKER.
Okay. So for everybody that's watching, go follow Alex and his work. It's fascinating. And I'm like, I kind of got a little private preview of what Alex is going to be up to in the coming months and hopefully years. And so keep an eye out for what he's going to be doing, because it's pretty fantastic. With that, I want to thank everyone for tuning in today to Sex Nerd Podcast. And please let me know in the comments if you'd like to have Alex back on the podcast to follow up on what he's doing. And well, with that, I think we're going to wrap up for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for having me.